Well, you know what? As Nathan mentioned, we're reading through the Bible. We've been doing this reading together. It's fantastic. Thank you, Pastor Nathan, for this opportunity. It's just a great legacy to bring to the church, and I'm very thankful to read too along with you. And we've been reading, yes, a big chunk, but guess what? This week we read through the entire book of 1 Corinthians and almost all of 2 Corinthians, right? And I don't know if you're like me, but when you get to read a whole chunk of the Bible, like a big chunk like that, especially books like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which are related around the town of, or the city of Corinth, and related around Paul's letter to them and the things that are going on in the church, you begin to see some themes. Who's seen some themes in 1st and 2nd Corinthians as you've read it? Yes. And as you see these themes, you begin to go, well, I think there are some things going on at that church. Now, when you get bogged down into one or two verses, you tend to just see perhaps Paul is explaining a little bit about the death of Christ or the resurrection or something like that, and you can pick out some truths in that of the death and resurrection or whatever it might be there's explaining there. But what you can also see when you step back from the trees, in a sense, as the forest, and begin to see, well, in the context, what he was trying to say was to address some bigger issues. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those bigger issues. But before we do, it's good again, isn't it, to go through some of the background. And you would have read just at the start of each of those books some of the context that we're reading in. But I wanted to reiterate a little bit of that context and think about the town or city of Corinth and where it's situated. And it's situated on this narrow neck of land. And in this narrow neck of land, there's a waterway this side and a waterway that side, and I'm not the geology bloke to be able to name them all off. That's Pastor Mick, and, he was good at all that sort of stuff. But there's a 4-mile stretch between one part of the one waterway and the other waterway. So you can imagine that in those days that we didn't have like airplanes and all that sort of stuff, and the superhighways on land weren't particularly easy to transport, so the way to travel was by boat. And so you had lots of trade coming through one side, and they, instead of having to sail all around the bottom and get through some of the dangerous territory, they actually unloaded the ships on one side and crossed across the 4 miles of land and then reloaded on the other side, and that's kind of the way it was. So Corinth became this trading city, a very great bustle, a kind of like a frontier town, a place where all cultures gathered, all traders from everywhere kind of gathered, and it was this mix of cultures together. And in this culture, of course, business is king, and struggling against each other is king, and looking for the next one up, bit better than you is kind of king, and that's how the culture was. Added to that was a very sexualized culture. And by this I mean that they actually had the temple of Aphrodite was there, Aphrodite was there, and they had 1,000 temple prostitutes. And if you just kind of have to try and picture how it was, politics, religion, and business was all kind of sexualized. In fact, your religion was sexual. So when we read in this and we read about how they were struggling with some kind of immoral acts to do with sexuality, you can understand why. And when they were struggling with, who's in control and who should be in charge, you can sort of understand why. There's this idea in Corinth that the sexual element of life is in everything, and that business is king, and that your power, if you're stronger than the next person, it's better. You can imagine that these kind of alliances and politics and all the huge mix of cultures the cutthroat business environment has kind of crept into the church. And so there's some stuff happening in church that mirrors the culture. It's probably worth pausing at that point in saying it's interesting that often what happens in the church is there's some things happening in the culture that are mirrored in the church. That what begins to happen is some ways that we do things and we're satisfied with in the culture begin to become normal in the church. And we begin to say, well, that's how we do it out there, therefore we should do it like this in here. And it's actually really hard to divorce culture from Christ and the church. And it gets muddy sometimes, where we go, well, but that's how it should be because it is like that. And the reality, what Paul was trying to say is, listen, the culture that's out there isn't the culture that's in here. And what Paul did quite strenuously is he tried to say to people, listen, there is Christ and the way of Christ. You know, the way of Christ is different to the way of the world. Jesus said that. Paul echoed it. And actually, he had to labor quite hard to make his point. I would suggest if Paul was here today, he would probably write a letter to the church. Somewhere, somehow, whatever their name might be. He might write a letter to us at Everton Hills. And he might say, you know, Everton Hills, First Everton Hills is the book. First Everton Hills Wesleyan Methodist Church. What might he say to us? How might he challenge us? How might he talk to us about, look, I've heard some things about your church. I've heard some things about this. Somebody has reported to me what's actually going on amongst some of you. And I'd like to address them, and I'd like to point you back to what's really going on and what should be happening in the life of the local church. So you can sort of imagine how this was in Corinth and how it could be today. One commentator said about Corinth on this topic, they said this: in Corinth, the simplicity of the gospel was being undermined by those who sought to turn it into a speculative mysticism of Greek philosophy, combining Christianity, folk religion, and esoteric wisdom. The super apostles attracted the metropolitan upper classes, just like Eastern philosophy has done today. Silver-tongued speakers would put on seminars and promise the keys to success and happiness. Because they made a little or some appeal to Christ, these super apostles convinced some of the Corinthian believers that they were simply bringing together the best wisdom, best secular wisdom and Christian belief. The gospel was not enough to make Christianity relevant in a pagan commercial center like Corinth. In order to really market it well, the church had to promise answers to questions the Bible never asked and solve riddles about which the Bible was not the least bit interested. Where the scriptures were silent, secular wisdom threw its 2 cents worth in. Wow. The sophisticated Corinthian, confident and self-assured, had little time for sin and judgment, guilt and grace. Religion was supposed to supply social glue, give people a philosophy of life and a way of living a happy and meaningful life. And you can imagine with that kind of thinking, the idea of prostitutes in the temple, the idea of dog-eat-dog business, the idea of the great Greek wisdom and the philosophers of the time, there was something going on which was causing enormous problems in the church. It doesn't sound too dissimilar to today. Christianity at times has descended into this popularity contest. Who's got the best church? Who's got the best sermons? You know, who's the most important? Sometimes the medium of Christianity or the way the message is delivered has become the message. If that makes sense. It's that the package that Christianity has put it in has become the message, be it a positive package or a negative package. I was chatting to someone just this morning and saying, you know, the condemnation of the church based on the Royal Commission into pedophilia has, in a sense, labelled the church, put the package of the church, in a sense, is in trouble because the message has been lost because the picture has become who we are. And the same is whether how we promote ourselves, whatever might be happen, both positive and negative. Sometimes marrying the secular and the sacred has robbed us of sacred power, the power of the sacred. Some parts of the church have opted for the super apostle at the expense of being founded on the simplicity of the gospel. That's why I loved what Chloe shared with us of the package of songs that she presented to us this morning. Were about the foundation of Christ, the cornerstone of Christ, and how it fits perfectly with what I want to share with you this morning. But before we go too far, and start to put names and places on organizations and people, I want to look at some of the characteristics of a super apostle, is sort of gleaned out of Corinthians. Super apostles thought they were better than everybody else and said so. Super apostles were critical of the weak and the poor and the small. Super apostles wanted to bring the newest cultural feature and combine it with the ideas of the church to make it more successful. Super apostles were critical of the church and how it was run. Super apostles had better ideas of how the church should run. Super apostles were clever and smart, and they attracted a gathering of people around them who would go, yeah, you're right. The church is like that, and it should change, and that's how it works. But the worst thing to do at this moment would be to imagine somebody else out there who does this. Let's bring it closer to home. The truth is that we could all fit into this role. It's all too easy to fall into this pattern. It's all too easy to be critical of the way things are done at church. It's all too easy to become the expert. It's all too easy to tell the church to adopt the latest things in order to be relevant. It's all too easy for ourselves to have super knowledge and better ways and to put down those who don't seem to be eloquent. And it's all too easy to gather a following of people around us who eagerly chat about the way the church should be and fix it, and it's just sort of, it feels good to do that, to get a few people around you who kind of, yeah, you're right. Sometimes we act a bit that way, though. I've certainly been guilty of this. So today I want to address some words to wannabe super apostles. I entitled my talk, Warnings to Wannabe Super Apostles. I want to see some ways that Paul addressed the super apostles and to see if there are some things that we can glean from doing this, some things that would help us avoid some traps, the same kind of traps the Corinthians fell into. And to do this, I'm going to pick out a few verses from 1 and 2 or 3 of 1 Corinthians. I mean, there's plenty, but just a few. So here are some warnings for wannabe super apostles. First warning is this: there is no one but Christ. There is no one but Christ. There's no room for division along the lines of who we follow. In some ways we get ourselves into trouble because if the church is known for nothing, it's known for multiplying numbers of following different ways and different kind of ideas. Often people will ask me, how come the church has so many different varieties? Well, there are answers to that. That's not for today. But it's interesting, isn't it, how Paul's warning us about this. There is no one but Christ. He says there are some people in the Corinthian church who are saying, I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. I follow Cephas. I follow Christ. Paul's going to say, listen, I want you not to think like this. Stop thinking like, we're the people over here. We follow Paul because he's like the original missionary. He's the guy. If you guys aren't following anybody, he's the guy that gets the Jewish system. He's able to talk about the Messiah Christ. He's the guy that really is planting. I mean, none of the other apostles are doing what Paul's doing. I'm a follower of Paul, and you ought to be too. Well, others might say, well, I follow Apollos. Well, Apollos was a very eloquent teacher of Christianity, very well praised around the churches. We hear the stories of him. And some were saying, look, there's Paul, who's not very articulate. He's kind of a bit messy. Who knows, having read Paul, that some of the things that get very confusing? Yeah? Well, at least Nathan knows that. And so, yes, sometimes you're there going, what actually is the point? And where are we going with this, right? So I can imagine that Apollos, perhaps he was like much more eloquent. And some were saying, listen, you got to go with Apollos because Apollos got it all together. He's clear. He's consistent. I like Apollos. And you should be followers of Apollos. And some are saying, well, I like Peter, Cephas, Peter is like Jesus said, and on this rock I'll build my church. And he's like the real guy. You're like the original disciple guy. You got to go with this guy. And others are going, that's just ridiculous. I follow Jesus. You will follow men, but I follow Jesus. It's interesting, isn't it? No one but Christ. Here's what Paul says. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. Who wants to be Chloe after Paul has singled you out as whinging about the church, right? Not me. You go back to church the next week and it's like, yeah, so you told on us, didn't you? You know, I don't want to be Chloe. But Paul pushes him out, lets him know she said something, and no good. Chloe tells me this quarrel. What I mean is this. One says I follow Paul, another I follow Apollos, another I follow Cephas, still another I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Paul says, was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? No. It's a hard word given the very dimensions and divisions that we have amongst ourselves as Christianities. Many of us could say, I follow Wesley, the Wesleyans. I follow the Baptist. I'm following Luther. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand why they're different denominations, and I'm celebrating the vast mosaic, I guess, of the Christian faith. But the problem is when you divide yourself up based on a particular identity, whether it be denominationally or somebody you've seen on TV who's a great speaker, it's fraught with danger. The quest is not to follow an organization or a denomination or a personality, but to follow Christ. And, Paul says, to seek to get along with everyone. This is not very representative of Christianity, but Paul could write this letter to the church today. He could write this letter to you and me, and he could say the same thing. Stop making it about the people you follow and the rightness of that. Make it about Christ. That's what counts. And start to think about others and how you can love them and show some kind of unity and solidarity with them. Of course, there are theological errors and things that need to be pointed out. I'm not talking about that today, but I'm saying in general, most denominational flavors and most different ideas, while they have some differences around the edges, we all are on the same team. The same team. We're not better, worse. It's just not the way it is. Now, but before you get too excited and you say, yes, so we're going to start saying this, we follow Christ. Be careful. Because what happens sometimes is that is just as bad. I've heard people say to me, I'm not into denominations. I'm a Jesus follower. You just made a denomination of one. It's you. Right? I follow Jesus Christ. I don't follow, Wesleyan or, Baptist or whatever. I read the Bible. Seriously, folks, come on. Paul points it out. He says, don't tell me I follow Cephas, I follow Christ. Pushes this aside because it's not really about you being so, smug and, I'm not like the... See, that's often when you hear that statement, it's like, I'm not like the rest of you who are all divided about this. I only follow Jesus, It's just in the same kind of vein. However, the problem with that, that's the caution. The problem with that, of course, is that's exactly who we should follow. But it's not about how better I am than you. It's about how better he is and how much I should focus on him. And I've experienced this, and I know you have too, where sometimes denominational or in separate ways you get told, that church. They don't really know, they don't really have it. Or sometimes I'm actually the guy that belongs to that church. And there's someone else there, they go, well, we do it this way. And if you guys finally one day get your act together, you'll be like us. And you know what? Sometimes we're on the other foot and we go, if you guys stopped acting like this, we might be interested. Can you see what I mean? And what Paul's trying to say is, come on, guys, stop it. This is the way. This is the kingdom. It's actually about Christ. And he alone, the cornerstone. So the challenge for us wannabe super apostles is this. It's worth taking a look at our attitude, both towards the people we place as icons and how we think of others compared to ourselves, and getting on a bandwagon of who's better and starting to be critical of them and those because they do it this way and they should, and if they really were doing it right, they'd do it like this. We kind of have lost the focus on the goal, and the goal is Jesus Christ and the way he teaches us to live with love and respect and so on. So, warning number 1. Here's warning number 2. To want to be super apostles. The gospel is foolishness. Don't get all clever on me. Don't get too smart for your own britches. The gospel in its simplest form is actually the only thing that matters. Its tenets are actually foolishness. Paul says this, where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Remember who he's talking to? Remember, these are people saying, I got Paul and I got Apollos and I got Cephas and I got Christ. And he's saying, where is this wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher who's got it all together? Has not God made foolish the very wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. God was saying it's not about the fancy, tricky kind of thing about that. It's actually quite foolish what happened. Jews demand a miraculous sign. Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. And here's the problem. You could add whatever you like in here. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles, complete lunacy to the Western world, crackpots to the evolutionists, pedophiles to the moral, compass. In some sense, you know what I mean? So there's a sense in which we're preaching actually something that's different. Christ was crucified. This should change our life, and somehow, we're getting this. It's foolish. And it was happening in Corinth, and it's happening today. Some people actually want to pretty up the gospel, make it more palatable. So we take sin out so people don't get offended. We turn the gospel into a motivation seminar, a self-help process to wealth and happiness. But that's not the gospel. That was happening in Corinth, and my goodness, that happens today. Paul was addressing those who come into Corinth with a better gospel, saying, look, you can't fix the gospel. You can't make it better. It can't make it more palatable. The gospel is raw, uncomplicated, completely confusing to those who don't understand it. It's the smell of death to those who are perishing. They're like, yeah, well, you can't talk to me like that. That's just rubbish. But it's the fragrance of life for those who discover what Christ can do for them and transform them. That's how the gospel works. It can't be prettied up. You can't make those who are smelling death get something other than the gospel, because it won't help them. It won't change their lives. It will still lead them to death. The gospel is about life transformation, about God rescuing us. And there are two issues here. One involves our tendency to want to make excuses for the gospel, and the other is that we become very clever at making it palatable. And since we have this tendency towards the characteristics of super apostle, then it's worth reminding ourselves to not look for the clever orators in the church who can spin a great talk that makes me feel good. It's worth reminding ourselves not to replace our preachers with smarty pants philosophical speakers who give us 7 ways to a better life. There is only one way to do Christianity, and that's through the foolishness of the gospel, which is not palatable to some, but it's the fragrance of life to those who God, through God's grace, go, I see. That's the church. That's number 2. Number 3 is this. A third warning to super apostles comes down to you and me. And this is it. You and I are not as good as we think we are. It's probably worth pausing there, isn't it? And just letting that sink in, because it's true. We're actually not as good as we think we are. Especially those of us who have that tendency to say, you know what, if the church just listened to me, they'd do a lot better. Got a few ideas that we're tweaking to make it better. You guys would be awesome if. We're not as good as we think we are. Paul says this in chapter 1, verse 26. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. God's looking for the nobody to make them a somebody. God doesn't need the somebody to help him out. God doesn't need to be helped out. He's okay. What he needs is humble servants. Sometimes this tendency towards the super apostle can make us start to think we have something to offer. We can help things along a bit. If, as I mentioned earlier, but as I said, God doesn't really need consultants. What he needs is obedient servants. He doesn't need the already awesome. He needs the willing servant. He doesn't need the person with a long list of credentials in helping organizations become popular. What he needs is humility and love, as Chloe shared with us this morning. None of it matters without love. It's not your pedigree or training that counts. It's your willingness to be humbled and let God work through you. There's no point in boasting about how much you know and about how much the church should get it. There's only one kind of boasting that counts. Paul tells us, I boast in who he is. So here's a challenge for us wannabe super apostles. We're not as good as we think we are. It is God who uses us through our weaknesses. And Paul can help us with that in verse 18 of chapter 3. He says, do not deceive yourselves. If only you think you are wise by this, if any of you think you're wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. Because it's not by the fancy things we are today that measure gospel success. It's by the standards of God and the simplicity of the gospel before we move forward. Here's the thing about Paul. If he wanted to, he's saying to the super apostles, he's saying, listen, if you want to fight based on who's good, I'm going to win that one. I know that's a bit arrogant, isn't it? But he says, if you want to fight on who's good, I'm going to win that one. If you want to fight on who's got pedigree, I got pedigree. If you want to fight on who trained under the best trainers, I was trained under the best trainers. If you want to fight based on who's done more work, I've done more work. If you want to fight based on who's suffered more, I've suffered more. I could win any one of these fights, but I'm not even going to try to win this fight because that's not the point. Be smart aleckly as you like, but in the end it comes down to one thing. Does Christ get honored? Is his gospel made clear? Do people get to accept this new way? That's what matters. And if I'm a nobody, that's all right. You might be a somebody, but only God gets the glory. That's how it should be. The fourth warning for wannabe super apostles is this: be careful what you're trying to build. Again, Chloe talked about this morning. Chapter 3, verse 10, but by the grace of God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and somebody else is building on it. but each one should build with care. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it's burnt up, the builder will suffer loss, yet will be saved even though escaping through the flames. Now here's the dilemma. We're actually all builders. We build on the work of those who've gone before. But you can't just build anything. And in recent times, it seems that building a kingdom has become an art form. Building my kingdom has become an art form. There is something attractive about the fancy church with all the programs, the lovely facilities. Goodness knows we have one of those. But the world's way of measuring things is different to God's way of measuring things. What the world sees as wonderful and successful sometimes doesn't even enter onto God's radar. There is only one foundation, and that foundation is Christ. And we must be careful what kind of ministry we want to build. It's easy to fall in the trap of competing with a great church somewhere, or a great program we see somewhere, or to make sure that we're as awesome as somewhere else, or as slick and as wonderful. But just spending a lot of money on something doesn't mean God is at work. And just because the world says it's successful doesn't mean God even cares. There is a test coming one day where God's fire burns through things that we build. Probably more figuratively than literally, but the only work that will survive is a work based on the foundation of Christ. In some sense, I like what Paul says is, you can build with stones, costly, gold, whatever you like, but actually, what's going to survive is what's built on Christ. And a fundamental foolishness of the gospel, and the best thing a super apostle can do, is not look to their training or their experience or what someone else has done, but look to Christ. So we have this tendency towards being super apostles. Let's focus closely on the foundation of Christ, the importance of the gospel, and stop comparing our church to some other great model. But simply ask ourselves this question: how can us build on the foundation of Christ? How can this local church not be some other local church? How can this local church focus on Christ, honor the foolishness of the gospel, and do what God called us to do? What does that look like for Hills Church? See, that's the only way we can build something that lasts, not only in the process of time, but into eternity. This is the only thing that will ever make us great. So in conclusion, this message is to all of us church fixers and church critics. This is a message to those of us who gather together with others to criticize the church or to fix her or tell her how she should be doing better. This is a message with some warnings to those of us with tendencies towards being a super apostle. Stop it. Only following Christ matters. The gospel can't be fixed. It's foolishness. You aren't as clever as you think you are. Only God is. And take a good look at what we're trying to build. Only something founded on Christ and the gospel will last. Amen.